Just to open, as Dolores was saying, these heavily armed right-wingers occupied the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge just 2 weeks ago outside of Burns, Oregon, declaring that they're willing to kill or be killed. And Ammon Bundy and his brothers, who are leaders of this takeover, are demanding that the federal government turn over millions of acres of publicly owned and federally administered land to not only to ranchers, but also to the lumber and mining industries. So we want to discuss where we stand on this issue and how we arrived at our view. And in opening it, I want to say that Monica Moorhead, who was Workers' World's candidate for president, wrote a really important article last week on the state, on racist police violence and the Black Lives Matter movement. And she re-raised the theoretical concept coming from Marx and Engels and Lenin, explaining the role of the capitalist state in class society. It's really important, and everything, so much of what we do is really based on understanding about the role of the capitalist state. In essence, armed bodies of men, the police, the army, the courts, the prisons, the whole body of law that defends property and enforces the right of the capitalists to own property and extract profit from our labor. And Monica explained that really the state is the instrument, or re-explained, of class rule, of one class over another. It's not an institution above society. Now, the response of the media, of the state, of the National Guard, of the federal agencies to this takeover in Bern, Oregon, it really exposes again the role of the capitalist state as a repressive apparatus and also as an arbiter among contending private property and ownership among the capitalist class, who have their own ruthless competition. So we want to first recognize that the state functions historically and again in Burns, Oregon, in contradictory ways toward people of different classes and nationalities. And the response is never, ever based on equal rights or equal justice or equal ownership, of course. And it's these double standards we want to expose. You have the corporate media who are describing these racist extremists as a patriotic militia, as freedom fighters, leaders of a populist uprising, even peaceful protesters. Can you imagine? I mean, but I'm talking about Fox News and CNN and radio talk shows that are really very sympathetically portrayed these forces and really all but champion their demands for unrestricted control of public land, saying, well, it's just open, unused. And the federal and local law enforcement agencies have had a total hands-off policy. They haven't called for martial law or called in the National Guard to end an armed occupation. Now, who are these armed white militia? Are they racist? Well, when you think of armed militias, remember George Zimmerman, an armed vigilante murdering 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. This was really the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, the refusal to accept, once again, that stamp of approval for the armed vigilante. After the police killing of 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, protests by really black youth in the thousands and thousands coming out night after night demanding justice for Michael Brown. How did the capitalist state respond to them? Martial law, National Guard, military equipment, armored vehicles, high-tech rifles, massive arrests. This picture really shows it so well, an unarmed black youth and just the sheer power of the state in massive force. And of course this is true in Baltimore and Chicago, in other cities right here in New York, or Staten Island, Brooklyn, Harlem. The very courageous Black Lives Matter movement has been met with the most repressive police, with threats, with drones. And their demands are very basic, and it's an unarmed movement. Their demand is for justice and a stop to the police killings. Now, because it happened at the very same, within days of each other, this was sort of what brought in the new year. Here was an exoneration of the police for the killing of 12-year-old Amir Rice, a black 12 years old, playing with a toy gun, shot within 3 seconds of the police arriving. And you think of how many black youth are killed holding a toy gun, a cell phone, or nothing at all, nothing at all. So there's never considered the right of the oppressed to defend themselves, even in their own homes. And we should never forget the MOVE bombing, the MOVE family and the supporters of John Africa, as they attempted to do in Philadelphia in 1985. The police bombed their home and burned out 65 other homes in that same block, killed 11 people, 5 of them children. Based on another police attack at another MOVE home, 9 members of the MOVE family are still in jail, serving 100-year prison sentences for asserting their right to self-defense within their own home. Now, it's also, when you think of taking over a federal wildlife reserve, a good time to remember Wounded Knee. Just in 1973, when the Oglala Lakota Nation and the American Indian movement held a 71-day encampment at Wounded Knee. Now, immediately, they were met with a brutal siege. Police, federal agencies, FBI, they faced assassinations, roundups. I mean, it really was a fierce war. What were they demanding? Simply abiding by the treaty obligations and an end to the theft of their resources on their own land by treaty. Now, Charlotte Rodriguez she is a chairperson of the Burns Paiute Tribal Council, and in an interview with National Public Radio, she really brought back this. This is really on land that was their land, this wildlife refuge. She said, if I, as a Native person, a person of color, were to go down there and do the same thing that these white armed forces were doing, they would have hit me on the head with a baton and dragged me out. Now, we could also think of so many of the Muslim people in prison and jail, rounded up, where to carry any kind of weapon in the U.S., in Europe, anywhere in the world, is to be labeled a terrorist. Even the use of a paintball gun used in play was treated as as in the case of the Fort Dix 5, as a proof of criminal activity. So we just want to compare this again and again, this absolutely outrageous and racist double standard. Now, who are these armed white men taking over a federal facility? They're well-known racists. Cliven Bundy and his sons are wealthy Nevada ranch owners. They're armed states' rights advocates. They were really the darling of the media a few years ago, until Cliven Bundy said things that were so outrageously racist on the media that even they could not promote him any longer, where he described that black people would be better off and preferred slavery, and I won't even repeat the other things he said. But this is the Bundy family. And what they were protesting and refusing to pay $1 million in grazing fees for their cattle on publicly owned land. Now, these publicly owned lands are already a 93% subsidy. But they refused to pay anything at all, and they asked their supporters to bring arms and join an occupation. They're part of an extremely reactionary and racist movement named Citizens for Constitutional Freedom. They say they're defending the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. And we want to always think, we're for the right of workers and oppressed to defend themselves, and that is what's always denied. They say they want to defend the Bill of Rights, but they're not for defending freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to a speedy trial of your peers. They're certainly not interested in equal rights. So it's not those kinds of rights. They're interested in the Second Amendment. And the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms in U.S. history, has a very different, this was really the right of militias to be used against slave uprisings and militias against the native peoples. And it was well understood that way at the time. And it was why it was guaranteed and written in to the Constitution as a way of, and it was demanded by the southern slave-owning states. The award-winning Black actor Danny Glover really said it best. He was speaking to a group of students at Texas A&M University a couple of years ago, and this created an uproar when he said the Constitution's Second Amendment was created to bolster slavery and take land from the Native Americans. He said, I don't know if you know the genesis of the right to bear arms, but the Second Amendment comes from the right to protect themselves from the slave revolts and the uprising of Native Americans. It was to stop a revolt from people who were stolen from their land, or a revolt from people whose land was stolen from. And that's the genesis of the Second Amendment. Now, I think Danny Glover said it pretty well, right? There's some real class truth in there, and you could see why that created an uproar. How dare you admit that that's really the basis of this much lauded right to bear arms? Now, these right-wing forces also declare that they're for states' rights. What's states' rights? This really goes back to the Confederate defense of slavery, doesn't it? The states' rights argument before and during the Civil War. And it was also the battle cry of the racists in defending segregation in the 1950s, 1960s. Remember, that's states' rights. And in the West, it's a reactionary movement that is anti-immigrant and racist, especially toward indigenous people. There's no other historic background to the states' rights movement in U.S. history. Now, back to the capitalist state, though. That's another term for the word state. We're talking about states' rights and then the Marxist explanation of the state. It's really to protect and defend the interests of the capitalist class. Now, this goes back to defending the interests of the slave owners, who not only was there enormous profit in the South, but there was also the Philadelphia and New York bankers and the Boston shipbuilders who benefited, who profited directly from the slave trade and the state's role in that. The Civil War was a war between northern industrial capital and the southern slave-owning capitalists who were producing for a world capitalist market. So it really comes back to what is happening under capitalism at each different period. As soon as the Civil War began, because the northern capitalists finally had a complete majority, really during the midst of the war, that's when they pushed through giving vast western lands to the railroads. It was passed in 1862. And it's also when they passed the Homestead Act, giving 160 acres of land free to any white homesteaders. So they already had a plan for what they wanted to do in terms of opening up the land, because this had been fought over whether this land would be free or slave. I go back over this because it's sometimes important to know kind of what role the state played and has played against the oppressed throughout U.S. history. And so a lot of history I'm just sort of pushing together in here, but the Civil War was really over a war of what kind of property would prevail, and it was not because the northern capitalists cared about enslaved people. They had also no sympathy or agreement with the white abolitionists, and that's important to remember. Now, after the Civil War, the land of the white plantation owners who had waged war against the federal government to maintain slavery, they were supposed to be expropriated to provide reparations for the formerly enslaved. That's what was promised, 40 acres and a mule, promised by the generals, promised by the politicians at the time, to every formerly enslaved black family, 40 acres and a mule. It never happened. What happened instead, 1877, all the federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and they were sent to expropriate and exterminate the indigenous peoples of the West, leaving the people, the black people of the South, the formerly enslaved, completely defenseless, and the former Confederate plantation owners utilized the armed militias of the Ku Klux Klan to wage a war of terror, nonstop, right up to the civil rights movement that really fundamentally challenged not only segregation, but this locked terror on the whole population. The whole role of every department, of every government agency is also racist. Even in the years after the Civil War, the years after, more than 95% of land of small black farmers has been expropriated. They're the smallest farmers. Now, also, just to say that the capitalist state acts in ways that are totally, I'm glad to be speaking after Deirdre, totally destructive of the environment and of all life. In clearing the land for the railroads and the land speculators. And, you know, today when you think back, and I think of really our history in challenging the war in Iraq, how did the U.S. wage the war in Iraq in 1991? What did they choose to bomb? They targeted every food processing plant, every food warehouse and storage facility and irrigation system and waterworks and sanitation and sewage, fertilizer plants, pharmaceutical plants, hospitals, the electric grid. That's how they fought the war. They were interested in the oil, but for the people, their plan was to absolutely destroy the population. Where did those war plans come from? Now, consider during the Civil War, Colonel Kit Carson, he'd waged a war against the Navajo people. How did he do it? This was 1863, 1864. He absolutely killed all their vast herds of sheep. They were sheep herders, the Navajo, and forcibly marched them west after burning their homes. This is when you think of the wars that the U.S. fights today, this is the heritage. And it was the same with the destruction of the buffalo herds, which were huge. The estimates are 30 to 100 million buffalo at one point were in the Great Plains. They were totally wiped out in a 4-year period. From 1872 to 1876, a very short period of time where the actual destruction of the buffalo herds. And again, it was a role played by the Army, who let hunters use their forts as bases of operation, the railroads, where they would actually drive trains and hand out guns to people just to take part in the shooting of the buffalo. And at the time, it was described, and in all the records today, that this was a way to clear the land of the indigenous people, to clear the land of the buffalo, and to totally wipe out all the herds. That process was finished, really, in great part, by 1876. And then, as I say, going back in 1877 is when federal troops were pulled out of the South and sent to the West to really begin the wars against the native people that reached a genocidal proportion. The native people were driven onto the most unviable land. And even after treaties were signed, if their land was found to hold anything of use, the land was again expropriated. Treaties be damned. And this was true whether it was gold in the Black Hills or oil in Oklahoma or uranium in Arizona. Now, let's go back to Oregon and the Paiute Nation, who say, this is our land. This land belonged to us. They certainly have claim. This is where they lived 10,000 years, and there's still the archaeological records of the presence of these tribes, and particularly the Paiute people, in Oregon for 10,000 years. The reservation they were originally promised was 1.5 million acres of land. In 1872, they got a tiny fraction of that. It was called the Malheur Reservation. But the cattle ranchers complained, and they wanted them off the land entirely. And 6 years later, 6 years after they were given this reservation, it was dissolved, and they were forcibly, in the dead of winter and in the highest snowdrifts, they were shackled and forcibly moved to the Yakima Reservation in Washington state. Now, some of the Paiutes hid, some returned home later, and several years later, they were given 10 acres of the Burns. It was the town of Burns then was set up on their land. They were given 10 acres of the Burns town dump to build their homes, but their children were barred from attending the local schools. Painstakingly, this small tribe, over the next 100 years, they managed to purchase 760 acres of their original tribal lands, and they reestablished the Burns Paiute Reservation. And 100 years later, in 1972, they were finally recognized as an independent Indian tribe. Imagine the struggle that took. Today, they've secured more than 11,000 acres. Still, that's small when you consider the millions of acres. They've secured 11,000 acres of allotment land, which are leased by the local ranchers for cattle grazing. Now, it's tribal land. There are lots of different ways of counting this. That is considered federal land. It's tax exempt, but it's under county jurisdiction. And this is some of the land that the Bundy brothers are saying they want. The Bundys are demanding this land and much, much more. They want free and unlimited access for lumber, for mining, and for ranching. And they have occupied this Malheur refuge to give voice to that demand. Now, just in closing, I want to say some points about the federal government actually today owns half the land in the West, including some 80% of Nevada and half the land in Oregon, and in a number of other states, 50, 60%. A large amount of this is really completely arid land or mountainous land or forest. In other words, it didn't have farming and valuable, it wasn't river land and whatnot. But the Bureau of Land Management today manages about 245 million acres of U.S. public land. And it's a capitalist state that allocates, mainly for private profit, this public land. It's a land that was expropriated from the indigenous people. It's also land that couldn't be farmed. As I say, it's arid, it's high. And their role has been how to balance this in ways that benefit agribusiness and lumber and mining and railroads and also sporting and a lot of other things, but how to make it profitable. They pay for building roads and bridges and dams and water allocation, but all of these things at the same time are free to businesses. Vast tracts of the national forests are today just public timber farms for private logging contractors. In 1872, the hard rock mining law allocated, and it's still used today, more than $1 billion a year is taken from public lands without royalties or fees being paid in minerals. Anyway, I don't want to go into all of this, but the federal irrigation bringing water and also the grazing fees is part of this also, what's handed over to private interests. It's what has been fought for again and again. There was something in U.S. history called the Range Wars. And these were actual wars, each with their own militia of sheep herders and cattle ranchers, and then against small farmers, also with their own militia. There were real wars in which the railroad industries and the big banks had the largest stake over what was going to be taken to market. And they also helped to arm these different militias. The one force that the state didn't help, the capitalist state didn't help, was millions and millions of small farmers who were simply driven off the land from the 1920s into the 30s, expropriated without really a penny. instead, there was a great deal of attention of bringing in cheap labor from China for building the railroads from the west, from Ireland building the railroads from the east, Japanese and Philippine labor, always how to help private business and do so with greater and greater exploitation of labor and of land. It was the same way in building the dams. Huge parts of native land was again expropriated because it was the least developed land, the easiest to grab hold of in building the dams. And that's there were 23 Indian reservations that had land expropriated on the upper Missouri. There were 31 federal dams built along the Columbia River in Oregon and Washington and its tributaries. When the Dulles Dam was built, it created an uproar because some of the oldest continuously inhabited villages in North America were flooded out in order to build this. So this is a period when the demand is being made to privatize everything. Privatize the post office, privatize hospitals, privatize schools, privatize prisons, waterworks, bridges. And part of this is to privatize this public land. And the Bundis are really, and these armed militia, are like the battering ram raising forth this demand to expropriate public land and turn it over to private interests. And it's important to see it and understand it that way. One other point I want to make just in closing is a racist foundation of the state of Oregon. It was the only state in the U.S. that was set up in 1859 saying that African Americans were prohibited from living, working, or owning property in Oregon. And you think of Oregon today as having a very progressive history, but in 1922, the Ku Klux Klan had 14,000 members, and every mayor, the governor, the state officials were proudly members of the Klan. Even Portland had totally segregated facilities. So I'll just let some other pieces here go, but the Bureau of Land Management is now trying to buy out some of the small ranchers because they're no longer viable. And that really is the basis of it. There are huge, huge ranchers like the Koch brothers. They're some of the biggest landlords in the West and also have big interests in the mining and in the lumber. And also Ted Turner, largest, I think he's the second largest landowner in the U.S. today. Huge, 2 million acres, and owns and has great access to this free land at subsidized prices for running his cattle. So, what would working class demands be in a struggle like this? Let's really close talking about that. How would revolutionary socialists address this burning issue? And what would a state of the working class do? Now, at one time, half the population lived on the land. Slaves, small farmers, tenant farmers, dirt ranchers. Today, 2% of the population are farm or ranch families, and then about another 15% is involved in growing or picking or processing or even selling of food and fiber. So it's a very small part of the population, and finance capital is sort of moving on. But this public land still exists. And what we would say, and a demand I would think that a revolutionary working class party would raise, is rather than allow the individuals and the companies who have devastated this land and grabbed it, these lands should be put under the guardianship of the indigenous nations, under their protection. This would be really a demand that would go to the heart of those who are demanding the land to say who should have the land and who have also been the best protectors of the land and still feel that deeply today. That would be one step toward justice and reparations, and I think is a way that we should look at this when we look at such a complex question today that the media has so distorted, and we want to always bring up who are the oppressed people and nations, what are their demands, what are their rights. That would bring real justice. Thank you. First point, I'm so glad that Monica raised Mexico, the theft of half of Mexico, if we're going to talk about stolen land. And also the more than 1 million acres that was expropriated from black farmers through, a lot of it through the Farm Bureau, just refusing to grant loans that white farmers, as a matter of course, could get. And also the demands of the Republic of New Africa for the return of the land, reparations, and the 5 states in the South. We shouldn't forget this, and we got to always, if we're going to talk about the land, you know, we're so much an urban revolutionary party. We think of the demands right here. But this is all a capitalist country built on stolen land. And recognizing that and responding to the demands of peoples for the return of this land and their right to be the custodians, the guardians, the decision makers of this land is extremely important, and we always want to raise it. And when organizations of the oppressed are making these demands, we want to do everything we can to support those demands politically, in our newspaper, and in political activities, and as part of a political program. So I thought that was a very important addition to this, and another example of just how these expropriations happen. They happen through the state. And that goes to another question that was asked, and that is sort of where is this going and what should be done? Because I mean, there are many people who feel, well, this may just play itself out. There's now about 15 people who are taking part in this occupation. It's terrible to use that term occupation when we think of the hundreds and hundreds that were part of Occupy Wall Street, and there were 1,000 smaller occupations around the country of people who took public space and were moved out. They weren't allowed to stay. Now these folks are allowed to go into town and, as they say, re-up and buy supplies and hold press conferences and come back to this area. But what is it that the big mining and lumber interests want? See, they want to use them as a battering ram, and they hope the state comes down on them. They hope it will, because it will allow them to raise up a great sympathy for these forces. And the one thing we always have to know is that anything that strengthens the capitalist state will be used against the workers and oppressed. Anything that makes it seem that they're acting in the interests of the people will be used against us. So that's, there are all kinds of groups that are sort of calling on the government to go in. But we actually don't think that anything which comes to the benefit of the capitalist state is good for working people. And they're looking always for 100 reasons to actually further strengthen their repressive apparatus. I also did want to veer off my talk a little bit and say something on the earlier talk on China, and the good comrade who raised a question about whether China should be blamed for this capitalist crisis happening right now, because this is a comrade who knows a lot about capitalism and the market. Now, what does the capitalist system always want to do? They always want to say it's not the system that's to blame. You know, there's a capitalist crisis about every 7 to 10 years over a period of more than 300 years. And you can even just Google and a list comes up from Wikipedia right away. Just capitalist economic crises list. And it, comes up, whether we're talking about tulip mania crisis back in 1637 or the South Sea bubble. Well, I mean, these are all speculative, huge speculative bubbles in 1720, or the Mississippi Company's collapse in 1720, or when we talk about Shays' Rebellion and the early capitalist crises right here in the late 1785 or something like that, 1790. It's one after the other after another. You can look at the list, and also the huge capitalist crises that had to do with the building of the railroads. At a certain point, the railroad is built, and that huge amount of steel and railroad ties and everything else is still churning out, and so there's a crash. It's the same thing whether you're talking about even the buffalo hides, which were just left to rot in the end because couldn't be sold. So U.S. history is absolutely full, and it is every 7 to 10 years, of one crisis after another, where always the workers pay, capital is further consolidated, there are huge mergers, whole industries go bust, and then are rebuilt. And always someone is to blame. I mean, we could look at what was called the OPEC crisis, and the OPEC oil-producing countries were supposedly all to blame in 1973. Remember that? Or Japan was to blame in 1986. There was a capitalist crisis. Wherever money pours in and then reaches a limit, Russia in 1998 and Argentina in 1999, and you could just go through again and again and again the Greek debt crisis and the subprime crisis and the housing market bubble, and all of these one after the other after the other. This is the way capitalism works. Housing bubble, and we know it in Detroit. I mean, whole cities are just literally torn up, plowed under, people, expelled from their housing. Industries closed, people who thought they had a job for life, and suddenly they have nothing, not even their homes, and not the jobs they had. So this is absolutely the way capitalism works, and China couldn't buy as much as the world could produce. That's why we say capitalism is at a dead end. It's so vastly, enormously productive that as soon as, when we say there's a glut now in the commodity market, it's not just oil and it's not just steel or gold or zinc or aluminum, it's every single commodity. That includes wheat and corn and soy and food in a starving world. There's a huge glut. And if they can't sell at a profit, they just dump it in a country that desperately, in a world, in a planet that desperately needs it. So we should not blame China for the latest capitalist crisis. It is a global system, and it flows wherever there seems to be. There's a market that they can sell, and they can sell as much as they possibly can. And when then they can't sell that at a profit, there is a huge crash. And they're coming sooner and quicker and closer together. They're willing to burn and pollute the whole planet. And not only do they never say the system is to blame, but when you have methane gas pouring out in Los Angeles or in Flint, Michigan, I mean the poisoning, the lead poisoning of children, are any of these capitalist owners and decision makers put on trial? At least in China they are. I mean, there's no justice ever against a corporate owner in this country where they are actually put on trial and jailed for crimes that kill so many people and are polluting and destroying the planet. So we want to keep this in mind and know that it is the state and the system that it props up that's the real enemy here.